Today, I will be talking to you about our most favorite bean, the coffee bean, and how it's grown, harvested, processed, and how it's been modified to fill the world's high demands. First, growth. Coffee seeds are generally planted in large beds in partially covered nurseries. The seed will be watered frequently and shaded from bright sunlight until they are strong enough to be permanently planted. Planting takes place during the wet season so that the soil remains moist while the bean grows strong roots. It will take approximately 3 to 4 years for the newly planted coffee trees to bear coffee cherries. The fruit called the coffee cherry turns a bright, deep red when it is ripe and ready to be harvested. There is normally one major harvest per year. However, in Colombia, there is typically 2 harvests per year. In most countries, the crop is picked by hand. It is a very labor-intensive and difficult process, though in places like Brazil, where the landscape is relatively flat and the coffee fields are huge, the process has been mechanized. The machines go over the trees and use huge spinning brushes to pick off the cherries. They will usually do this 2 or 3 times per tree to make sure that all the cherries are picked. Whether by hand or by machine, all coffee is harvested in one of these 2 ways. One of them is strip-picked. All of the cherries are stripped off the branch at one time, either by machine or hand. Another is selectively picked. Only the ripe cherries are harvested, and they are picked individually by hand. Pickers rotate among the trees every 8 to 10 days, choosing only the cherries which are at the peak of ripeness. Because this kind of harvest is labor-intensive, the coffee will be more costly. A good picker will average around 100 to 200 pounds of coffee cherries per day. This will end up in producing 20 to 40 pounds of coffee beans. Once the coffee has been picked, it is loaded into trucks and taken to the processing plant. Processing must begin as quickly as possible to prevent the fruit from spoilage. This can happen in 2 ways, in which depends on the location and local resources. The dry method. Freshly picked cherries are spread out on huge surfaces to dry in the sun. To prevent the cherries from spoiling, they are raked and turned throughout the day and then covered at night or during rain to keep them from getting wet. Depending on the weather, this process might continue for a few weeks for each batch of coffee until the moisture content of the cherries drops to 11%. Once the beans are dry, they must go to the mill. The wet method. First, the freshly harvested cherries are passed through a pulping machine to separate the skin and pulp from the bean. Then the beans are separated by weight as they pass through water channels. The lighter beans float to the top while the heavier ripe beans sink to the bottom. They are passed through a series of rotating drums which separate them by size. After separation, the beans are transported to large water-filled fermentation tanks, where they sit for several hours depending on the kind of coffee. Depending on combination of factors, such as the climate and the altitude, they will remain in these tanks for anywhere from 12 to 48 hours to remove the slick layer of mucilage that is still attached to the parchment. While resting in these tanks, naturally occurring enzymes will cause this layer to dissolve. When fermentation is complete, the beans feel rough to the touch. The beans are rinsed by going through additional water channels, then they are ready for drying. If the beans go through the wet method, they must sit outside to dry for much longer than the beans that go through the dry method in order for the beans' moisture to drop to 11%. Once again, the beans are raked and turned throughout the day and must be covered during rain and overnight to keep them from spoiling. After the beans are dry, they must go through a milling process before being exported. Workers pour the dry cherries into hulling machines to remove most of the red shell and the parchment. Then a polishing process that is optional removes any extra parchment from the beans. Polished beans are seen as superior to unpolished ones, but in reality there is very little difference. When this is complete, the beans get sorted out by workers. The workers remove any beans that have color flaws and sort them by weight and size. Finally, the beans are packed into jute bags which hold around 60 kilograms of dry coffee beans and are shipped to the packaging facility for any specific company. It is estimated that in 2016, the world will have exported more than 152.7 million 60-kilogram bags of dry coffee beans that are ready to be roasted. That's around 962 million kilograms of coffee. In the US, Only $18 billion was spent on coffee last year, and coffee is worth $100 billion in the whole world. Did you know that coffee is the second biggest trade in the world after oil? With all this coffee production, it is no wonder that 25 million people depend on this industry to feed their families and live well. The final step is for the coffee shop to roast the coffee beans to 10 to 16 minutes, then it's to the grinding machine to finish that early morning necessity. But what about pesticides and chemical fertilizers? Did you know that coffee is one of the biggest chemically treated crops in the world? Every year, 250 pounds of pesticides and fertilizers are spread on 1 acre of coffee trees. When you sip your conventional coffee from big brands such as Nestle, you are ingesting pesticide residues, which can cause major health problems such as cancer and miscarriages for pregnant women. In reality, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has little control over the type of amount of pesticides used on imported coffee. So the best thing you could do is drink organic coffee. Look for USDA or the CCOF symbol. This ensures that it is truly organic. Coffee on its own has its own effect on us as well, even in organic coffee. In most kinds of coffee except decaf, there is caffeine. This makes you more alert, less drowsy throughout the day, until it wears off. Decaf, however, doesn't have any caffeine, but is known to be carcinogenic because they need to be treated with way more chemicals. But what about the workers, farmers, and families that depend on this early morning craving? Obviously, workers who work in fields of industrial farms are very exposed to harsh chemicals that could affect their well-being. But also, there have been hundreds of cases where women, men, and children have not been given half the things they need to attain a happy, healthy life. There have been several cases of labor violations made by industrial coffee manufacturers over the span of a few years. In 2012, the U.S. Department of Labor discovered widespread labor violations in coffee plantations in Hawaii. They reported violations that included failures to pay workers minimum wage and overtime, exploiting migrant workers, illegally hiring coffee pickers as independent contractors, and exploiting children as young as 5 years old to pick coffee cherries. On several farms in Central America, there have been many housing problems. Workers would have to sleep in rooms with all the other workers on bunk beds, without mattresses, no blankets, bug nets, or pillows. The houses had no insulation, floors, or solid walls. They were just a bunch of pieces of scrap wood put together in the shape of a shed. In conclusion, I hope that you learned a lot about the production of coffee and how it affects us. Thank you for listening.